The ancient roots of Christmas run deep into our past, long before Christianity co-opted so many of the old traditions and slapped a Jesus Save sticker on them. And in times of yore, observing the winter solstice was more than just a celebration. There was a balance to be met. Our ancestors acknowledged the power of the cold, crushing winter that lay before them, showing reverence to their gods with feasts and songs and ritual sacrifice. And today you might know that some of the symbols of the season have survived the Christianization of the holiday. Like the Christmas tree is a callback to the ancient Roman Saturnalia celebrations. Caroling came from the old Germanic tradition of wassailing or Yule singing. Santa looking, suspiciously like Odin, the Yuletide god of yore. Even kissing under the mistletoe and decking the halls with boughs of holly. All of these have been with us for thousands of years, predating the days when uptight Bible thumpers came through and forcibly put the Christ into Christmas. But today's version of Christmas is lacking something that the ancient versions were never without. Capitalism and Christianity have collaborated to turn the season into something shallow and sanitized, focused only on the facade of cheerful consumerism, of buying and giving and eating and drinking, of hallmark happy families joyfully celebrating in gleaming, glittery gluttony. But there's something missing, because all things must have balance. Otherwise, it's hard to perceive the difference between two opposite forces. Like, we only feel the heat after coming out of the cold. And a meal is so much better when you've known hunger, and light can only be seen when it's illuminating the darkness. But the Christmas of today doesn't leave room for the balance between light and dark, and in all of its forced cheer, it leaves a void where the darkness should be, a void that gets darker for going unacknowledged, a void that is hungry, a void you just might fall into and disappear forever.
What is Santa bringing?
It was Christmas Eve 1945 in Fayetteville, West Virginia. George and Jennie Sodder and their 9 children were enjoying a quiet holiday at home. But when their typical bedtime came around, 5 of the Sodder children asked for special permission to stay up late. These 5 kids were Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, all ranging in age from 14 to 6 years old. And Jenny agreed to let them stay up late, under the condition that they'd remember to go out and put the farm animals away for the night, turn out the lights, close the curtains, and lock the door before going to bed. George and Jenny went to bed, while their 19-year-old daughter Marian fell asleep on the couch, perhaps to keep some semblance of watch over the younger children. Around midnight, Jennie Sodder woke up to the sound of a ringing telephone. When she went out into the hall and picked up the receiver, she heard laughter and clinking glasses on the other end of the line. A strange woman spoke to Jenny, asking for someone who Jenny didn't know. So she told the woman she had the wrong number, and the woman gave an eerie giggle and then hung up the phone. Jenny was understandably freaked out by this late-night caller, but her attention soon turned to the fact that all the lights were on, the curtains were still open, and the front door was still unlocked. Marian was still asleep on the couch, but the 5 children who had asked to stay up late were nowhere to be seen. Jenny assumed that the children had gone to bed without completing the chores that she had assigned to them, so she just went about turning off the lights, closing the curtains, locking the door, and then she went back to bed. But as Jenny was drifting back to sleep, she heard what sounded like something landing on the roof, followed by a rolling sound down the side of the house, and then she smelled smoke. She shook George awake and ran to the door of the bedroom. The hallway was filled with smoke, and flames covered the stairway up to the children's bedroom. George and Jenny shouted up the stairs for everyone to get out of the house quickly, but once out front, a head count showed that the 5 children who had asked to stay up late were not present with the rest of the family. The flames grew quickly and blocked George from being able to get back into the house. Thinking that the only way to get the 5 children out of the house would be to take them out through the top floor window, George raced around to the side of the house where a ladder usually stood, but the ladder was gone. George then thought that if he could move one of his trucks around to the side of the house, he could stand on top and help the children out through the window. But George found that neither of his trucks would start, despite having run perfectly fine the day before. In the end, all that George and Jennie and the 4 children who had managed to escape could do was watch their home burn to the ground. Eventually, nothing was left except for charred timbers, rubble, and the wreckage of their basement. A fire truck didn't even arrive at the scene until 8 a.m. on Christmas morning, long after the fire had burned itself out. Local police followed the firemen to the scene and did a cursory investigation. A coroner was consulted, and it was determined that the 5 children had likely died in the fire and that the fire had been caused by faulty wiring. But George and Jennie were not satisfied with this explanation, and they wanted a more thorough investigation because they didn't understand how the fire could have been caused by faulty wiring when they recalled seeing that their Christmas lights stayed lit throughout the early stages of the blaze. They suspected that there was something more to be discovered, and they had good reason to be suspicious. First and foremost, there were no human remains found anywhere in the rubble. Sifting through all of the ashes of their burned down house produced no human skeletons. It takes at least 2 hours at a temperature much higher than a typical house fire would burn for a skeleton to fully disintegrate. But according to the Sodders, the fire at their home burned for less than an hour. There should have been 5 skeletons amongst those ashes. And Jennie recalled finding their appliances still intact and recognizable in the wreckage, making it harder for her to accept that her children's bodies had burned up completely in the blaze. Then a bus driver came forward and told George and Jennie that he had seen what he described as fireballs being thrown onto the roof of the Sodder house on Christmas Eve. Then a woman somewhat familiar with the Sodder family claimed to have seen the 5 children go by in a strange car while the fire was blazing. At a diner 50 miles outside of Fayetteville, a waitress claimed to have served breakfast to the 5 children on Christmas morning, though she couldn't recall how many adults accompanied the children at the time. As word spread and photographs of the 5 missing children started to circulate, a woman said that she saw 4 of the children in the company of 4 adults at a hotel in South Carolina. Armed with these facts, George and Jennie went back to the police and demanded that the fire be further investigated, but the police refused, claiming that the coroner's inquiry had proved that no crime had occurred. So George and Jennie continued their investigation without the help of the police. George would repeatedly dig through the ruins looking for any clues, and eventually he found a few fragments of human bones and an internal organ. But this discovery only seemed to add to the mystery of the vanished children, because tests showed that the organ that George found was a fairly fresh cow's liver, and that the bone fragments he found, while they were human, showed no signs of exposure to fire and had come from someone much older than any of the 5 children. It's almost as if these items were placed there by someone with an interest in getting George and Jennie to give up their search for their missing children. But they never did. In 1952, the family put up a billboard at the site of their former home, offering a $5,000 reward for any information about their missing children. The billboard generated a few tips, but none of them led George and Jennie any closer to the truth. And then, in 1968, 23 years after the fire, Jennie received an envelope in the mail. It had been mailed from a city in Kentucky, and there was no return address, just the postmark. Inside was a photograph of a young man, and on the back of this photograph was written, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. I, Lil Boys, A 90132. Authorities deemed it to be a hoax, but George and Jennie thought that the photograph looked exactly how Louis would look as an adult. The family hired a private investigator to go to Kentucky and track down the young man in the photo, but this private investigator left West Virginia and was never heard from again. The 1968 photo was the last possible evidence in this case that has ever come to light. George would die in 1969, and Jennie would die 20 years later, neither of them ever believing that their 5 children perished in a house fire on Christmas Eve in 1945. And to tell you the truth, I don't really believe that the 5 Sodder children were totally obliterated by a house fire either. I mean, it'd be weird enough for 5 bodies to completely disintegrate in a house fire, but it's really the circumstances surrounding the fire that make the whole thing super suspect. Like, what's up with the weird phone call? The sound of something hitting the roof? The missing ladder and the trucks that wouldn't start? It all seems so strange, and I don't think you can chalk it all up to mere coincidence. Something happened at the Sodder home that night. And sure, maybe the kids were kidnapped. At the time of the fire, George seemed pretty convinced that the children might have been taken by the Sicilian mafia in retaliation for the fact that George, who was of Italian origin, was really outspoken about his criticisms of the fascist government in Italy under Mussolini. And while I know that the anti-Antifa crowd can be pretty confrontational about how bad they want a boot on their neck, I think we have to entertain the possibility that something even stranger happened here. Alright, imagine this. The 5 children stay awake past their bedtime on Christmas Eve. They whisper and giggle and play with their toys while the other children and their parents are all fast asleep. And at some point, they realize that they have to complete the chores that were assigned to them. So they pull on their boots, they put on their coats, and they step out into the dark December night. And as they walk across the field to corral the animals into the barn for the night, something waits for them. Something old and dark and almost forgotten. That's right, baby. I'm talking about an Anti-Claus. You see, there are a lot of gods of the winter solstice. All of them far older than our buddy Saint Nick, who, according to Christian lore, gives presents made by his magical elves to every kid in the world with the help of his magic flying reindeer to celebrate the birth of Jesus for some reason. But I mean, I'm here trying to convince you that an ancient alpine demon stole a bunch of kids on Christmas Eve in 1945, so far be it from me to judge other people for their flights of fancy. Anyway, in a lot of places where Christians busted down the cultural door and forced everyone to convert to their religion, some scraps of the old beliefs remained. Particularly, it seems, around the winter solstice. These ancient people knew the danger of ignoring the dark. They kept the balance by embracing a whole host of strange folkloric figures, the most well-known of which is Krampus. And yes, we love Krampus. I love Krampus. What's not to love? The Victorian Krampus postcards are some of the most deranged art I've ever seen in my life. I literally laughed myself to tears the day that I first learned about Krampus, looking at these images. But Krampus is more than just these postcards. It's hard to trace his origins, but anthropologists believe that he predates Christianity and only became tied to the Advent season after Catholicism took over by force. Curiously, his name seems to imply that he's always been a menacing figure, coming from either the Bavarian Krampen, meaning dead or rotten, or from German, meaning claw. And while it's hard to know exactly how Krampus was worshipped or celebrated in the old days, I bet it's pretty similar to how he's celebrated today. Because Krampus traditions still remain in some areas of Europe, especially in Austria. And let me tell you, they are wild. The night before the Feast of St. Nicholas is known as Krampusnacht, and it's celebrated by crowds of dudes dressing up in these crazy Krampus costumes and going door to door, almost like trick-or-treating. Only they threaten to beat the children at every house they visit and are given schnapps and gifts to appease them and spare the children of the house from the switches that the Krampuses carry. Because that's the thing, Krampus is here to punish. He's a visceral, terrifying creature that counters the lesson of consumerist greed that we teach children at Christmas time today. You know, like, be good, or Elf on a Shelf is gonna tell on you like some kind of shift supervisor to you superior, and then you're not gonna get presents or whatever. No. Krampus is literally gonna beat your ass, throw you in chains, and drag you to fucking hell. And he's not alone. There's a whole host of other old gods of the solstice who have stuck around. Figures like Perchta, another Germanic beast of folklore, who can appear as either a beautiful woman, white as snow, or an old hag. Perchta is said to roam the countryside at midwinter and to enter homes, in the 12 days between Christmas and the Epiphany. Perchta, it seems, is particularly interested in whether children have done all their chores and worked hard over the year. And she's especially focused on the girls of the household, making sure that they've spun their share of flax or wool for the year. And if they had, the children might find a small silver coin left by Perchta in one of their shoes the next morning. And if this is sounding a little Santa Clausy to you, fear not, because Frau Perchta takes a hard turn into gratuitous violence if she's not pleased with your flax spinning. If your chores aren't complete, Perchta will slit your belly open, pull out all your intestines, and stuff the hole with straw and pebbles. Oh, she'll also just do that if you eat anything on her feast day other than the traditional meal of gruel and fish. So, that's Perchta. In Poland, there's Turoń, who is celebrated in costume in a similar style to Krampus, visiting homes and wrapping the floors with sticks until he's appeased with apples and vodka to leave the children be. He often accompanies carolers and will tackle anyone who stares too long at them. It's also believed that a poke from the Turoń's horns will bestow fertility on the women of the household. You know what I mean? In Iceland, there's Grýla, a garish giantess with a hunger for the flesh of mischievous children. Grýla comes along with a host of equally morbid characters. First, there's her husband, Leppalúði, who is actually Grýla's third husband. No shade on my girl. Honestly, if the marriage isn't working out, eat your husband, bitch. And apparently, Leppalúði knows his place, because this big burly himbo just stays at home and keeps the cave while Grýla is away collecting ingredients for her favorite meal, a stew made from the meat of bad children. Together, Grýla and Leppalúði have 13 children, who are known as the Yule lads, and each one is named after their favorite way of causing mischief in the days leading up to Christmas. And their house pet is my favorite Christmas beastie, the Yule cat, a big black cat who lurks the snowy countryside around the Yuletide season and is quite a fashionista, as he will attack and devour anyone who hasn't received new clothes by Christmas Eve. In France, there's Père Fouettard, and excuse me if that's terrible, I never took a day of French, so let's call him Father Whipper, because that's what it translates to. So Father Whipper appears as a man with a sinister face, wearing dark robes, who is scraggly and unkempt. And according to legend, Father Whipper was a butcher who would kidnap kids to rob them, which doesn't really make sense to me, because like, how much money are you getting off kids? Like, I think you just were into this. I think that was just your thing. But anyway, he'd kidnap the children, rob them, and then he'd cut them up into pieces and pickle them. And apparently, when St. Nicholas discovered this crime, he resurrected all of the pickled children and then decided to employ Father Whipper as his sidekick to punish the bad children. Because apparently, St. Nicholas is a sociopath who likes to delegate. There's also La Befana of the Sodders' native Italy, who rides her broomstick through the sky, visiting the homes of children all over Italy, bearing gifts of candy and toys for good children, and coal and sticks for the bad ones. But despite La Befana's somewhat hag-like appearance, her legend seems devoid of some of the more gory trappings of some of her Christmas monster contemporaries. But of most interest to the case at hand, in my opinion, is Belsnickel. Now, it's believed that Belsnickel came from Germanic folklore and is extremely similar to Krampus in appearance and characteristics. And his legend is told most commonly amongst the Pennsylvania Dutch people, whose presence spread across Pennsylvania, Maryland, and, you guessed it, West Virginia. And while Belsnickel is known for giving candy to well-behaved children, he also has a dark side. He arrives holding chains and whips, and will beat naughty children for their misdeeds, or perhaps even drag them away to eat as a meal in the long, dark days of winter to come. And there's something about the disappearance of the Sodder children that feels cryptid in nature to me. Like some terrible beast might have landed on their roof that night. Something ancient that came from the dark of the old woods, and happened to notice that the 5 children were up past their bedtime, ignoring their chores to play with their toys by the light of the Christmas tree. And maybe this beast was hungry. Maybe it had been many decades since its last meal, and maybe it waited until the children came out that night, where it could feast undisturbed. And that's all. I hope you guys had a happy, creepy, cozy holiday season. I'm sorry I've been gone so long, but it turns out that revising a novel while also working retail during the holiday season is a perfect recipe for burnout. So I just haven't had the brain power to do any videos this month. But I hope you have fun with me today, and I do plan to get back on schedule, at least until my next deadline. Until next time, sleep tight. Don't let the Yule cat bite.